What if everything you learned about Philippine history was incomplete? What if civilization in these islands did not begin in 1521 when Magellan arrived? What if Filipinos were building kingdoms, trading with China, writing in Sanskrit, and establishing sultanates centuries before Spain knew these islands existed? The truth is hidden in copper plates, burial caves, and ancient boats. And the evidence proves Filipino civilization existed long before colonization. Welcome to Inside the Philippines. Before we begin, I need to say this. Filipinos built empires. You traded across oceans. You wrote complex legal documents. You created sophisticated political systems. Your ancestors were not waiting to be discovered. They were already here, thriving, building, and governing. If you want more content that shows the real history of the Philippines, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications. Drop a comment and tell me what part of pre-colonial history you want us to cover next. Let me know where you are watching from. Now let me show you the history they did not teach you in school. Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521. For centuries, historians acted like Philippine history started that year. They were wrong. The Laguna Copperplate Inscription pushed back the start of recorded Filipino history by 600 years. The document dates to 900 CE. That means Filipinos were writing, trading, and governing 621 years before Magellan. But the story goes back even further. Austronesians reached the Batanes Islands in the northernmost Philippines by around 2200 BCE. Negrito groups were the first inhabitants to settle in the prehistoric Philippines, with evidence suggesting they arrived sometime after 46,000 years ago. This is not mythology, this is documented history, and it starts thousands of years before Europe knew Asia existed. Who were the first Filipinos? Negrito groups, divided between those in Luzon and those in Mindanao, may come from a single wave and diverged subsequently, or through two separate waves. This likely occurred sometime after 46,000 years ago. Negritos are the true first Filipinos who date back to 50,000 years. These were hunter-gatherers. The Negritos are characterized by small size and African-like features, including dark skin and curly hair. Spanish missionaries who arrived in the 16th century named the group Negrito, which means little black person. But here's what most people get wrong. Genetic studies suggest that Negrito populations are closer to East Asian peoples than to Africans, indicating they descended from the same ancient East Eurasian population. They did not come from Africa. They developed their features independently through adaptation to tropical rainforests. Negrito groups entered Luzon, likely via Palawan and Mindoro Islands. Another Negrito migration entered Mindanao sometime after 25,000 years ago. These groups survived for tens of thousands of years. They hunted, they gathered. They lived in caves like Taban Cave in Palawan and Calao Cave in Cagayan. In 2010, there were 50,236 Ada people in the Philippines. There were 55,473 Adai people, according to the 2020 census. They still exist today. They are the descendants of the original inhabitants of these islands. Around 3000 BCE, everything changed. The Austronesian expansion was a large-scale migration from Taiwan, occurring around 3000 to 1500 BCE. Austronesians reached the Batanes Islands in the northernmost Philippines by around 2200 BCE. They used sails sometime before 2000 BCE. These were not random arrivals. This was organized migration. According to archaeologist Peter Bellwood and linguist Robert Blust, Taiwanese indigenous peoples first sailed from Taiwan to the northern islands of the Philippines around 3000 BCE, just 1,000 years after they migrated from mainland China to Taiwan. They brought agriculture, they brought pottery, they brought new languages. These Austronesians traveled by boat and settled in northern Luzon, in the archipelago of the Philippines, intermingling with the earlier Negrito population who had inhabited the islands since about 23,000 years earlier. This mixing created modern Filipinos. The Austronesians assimilated the earlier Negrito groups, resulting in the modern Filipino ethnic groups, which all display various ratios of genetic admixture between Austronesian and Negrito groups. From Luzon, they spread south. They reached Visayas, they reached Mindanao. They crossed to Borneo in Indonesia. They eventually sailed as far as Madagascar in the west and Easter Island in the east. The Philippines became the launching point for one of the greatest human migrations in history. By the time kingdoms rose in other parts of Southeast Asia, Filipinos had already developed their own political system. The Barangay. The smallest barangays were communities of around 30 to 100 households, led by a Datu, or a leader with an equivalent title. Larger, more cosmopolitan polities dominated the coasts, particularly river deltas. Datu is a title which denotes the rulers of numerous indigenous peoples throughout the Philippine archipelago. Only a member of the birthright aristocracy called Maganu, Nobleza, Maharlika, or Timagua could become a Datu. The Datu was not an absolute monarch. Leadership in pre-colonial Philippine society was generally collective, and the Datu was not a monarch, but a respected leader who ruled with the council of Maganus, the noble class, Babaylans, shamans, and other influential individuals. Society was stratified into clear classes. Pre-colonial Philippine society within the barangay was generally divided into four main classes. the Datu, the chieftain or headman, the Maharlika, the noble class, the Tamawa, the freemen or commoners, and the Alapin, the dependent or slave class. But here is what matters. This was not chaos. This was organized governance. Each barangay functioned independently. Datus made laws. They settled disputes. They commanded warriors. They managed trade. In large coastal polities, such as those in Maynila, Tondo, Pangasinan, Cebu, Panay, Bohol, and Butuan, some datus took the title of Raja or Sultan. These were not primitive villages. These were functioning governments with social hierarchies, legal systems, and military organization. The Philippines was never isolated. The Sulu archipelago was an entrepot that attracted merchants from South China and various parts of Southeast Asia beginning in the 14th century. The name Sulu is attested in Chinese historical records as early as 1349. Chinese traders came to the Philippines long before that. They traded porcelain, silk, and metal goods for gold, pearls, and forest products. Archaeological evidence proves this. Chinese ceramics have been found in burial sites across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, dating back to the Song Dynasty, 960 1279 CE, and earlier. The Philippines sat at the crossroads of maritime Southeast Asia. Ships from China sailed south. Ships from India, Arabia, and the Malay kingdoms sailed east. The Philippines connected these trade networks. Filipino traders were not passive recipients. They were active participants. They built boats. They used sails sometime before 2000 BCE. In conjunction with their use of catamarans, outrigger boats, lash lug boats, and the crab claw sail, this enabled phases of rapid dispersal into the islands of the Indo-Pacific. These were advanced maritime technologies. Filipinos crossed oceans. They traded across vast distances. They brought wealth back to their barangays. In 1987, a laborer found something extraordinary near Laguna de Bay, a copper plate with writing. The Laguna Copperplate Inscription is an official acquittance certificate inscribed onto a copper plate in the Shaka year 822, which corresponds to Monday, April 21st, 900 CE. It is the earliest known extant calendar-dated document found within the Philippines. Let me repeat that. April 24, 900 CE, 621 years before Magellan. The inscription was mainly written in Old Malay using the Old Javanese script called Kawi script, with several technical Sanskrit words in either Old Javanese or Old Tagalog honorifics. What does this prove? Filipinos were literate. They used multiple languages. They understood Sanskrit, Old Malay, and Old Javanese. The type of script used has been identified as the early Kawi script, a writing system that originated in Java and was used across much of maritime Southeast Asia during the 10th century. The document itself is a debt relief certificate. It states that it releases its bearers, the children of Namoran, from debt in gold amounting to 1 kati and 8 sawarnas, which equals 865 grams or 27.8 troy ounces. This means Filipinos had legal systems. They recorded transactions. They used standardized weights for gold. They had officials with authority to cancel debts. The document mentions the Tagalog city-state of Tondo. Tondo was a functioning kingdom in 900 CE. It had leaders. It had territories. It had power. This copperplate destroyed the myth that Filipinos had no civilization before colonization. The Laguna Copperplate shows something else, Indian influence. The inscription shows evidence of strong Indian cultural influences through Srivijaya in the Philippines before Spanish colonization in the 16th century. Srivijaya was a maritime empire based in Sumatra. It controlled trade routes across Southeast Asia from the 7th to the 13th century. The Philippines fell within its sphere of influence. Filipino kingdoms adopted Indian cultural elements. They used Sanskrit terms. They followed Hindu-Buddhist concepts of kingship. They incorporated Indian art styles and religious practices. But they did not become Indian colonies. They selectively borrowed what worked for them. This is called Indianization. It happened across Southeast Asia. Kingdoms in Cambodia, Thailand, Java, and the Philippines absorbed Indian culture while maintaining their own identity. Datus, who ruled principalities such as Butuan, Cebu, Bohol, Panay, Mindoro, and Manila, also shared many customs of royalties and nobles in Southeast Asian territories, especially in the way they used to dress and adorn themselves with gold and silk. Gold was everywhere. Spanish chroniclers noted that Filipinos wore gold jewelry extensively. Archaeological finds confirm this. Gold artifacts have been discovered in Butuan, Surigao, and other sites across the Philippines. The kingdom of Tondo was not alone. Other powerful polities existed: Cebu, Butuan, Maynila. Each controlled trade, each had military power. Each maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. In the 14th century, another transformation began. Islam arrived. In 1380 CE, the Sunni Sufi scholar Karim ul-Makhdum came to Sulu and introduced Islam to the Philippines. The Sheikh Karim ul-Makhdum Mosque in Simunul, Tawi-Tawi, established in 1380, is considered the cradle of Islam in the Philippines. Arab and Malay traders brought the religion. Filipino leaders converted. Entire communities followed. Islamic historian Cesar Adab Majul argues that Islam was introduced to the Sulu archipelago in the late 14th century by Chinese and Arab merchants and missionaries from Ming China. By the 15th century, Islam had spread across Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. In 1450 CE, Johor-born Arab adventurer Sayyid Abubakar Abirin came to Sulu and lived with Raja Baginda Ali. Sayyid Abubakar eventually married Ali's daughter and inherited Raja Baginda's polity, which he turned into the Sultanate of Sulu and became its first sultan. The Sultanate of Sulu became a major power. At its peak, it stretched over the islands that bordered the western peninsula of Zamboanga in Mindanao in the east to Palawan in the north. The Sultanate controlled trade. It established Islamic courts. It built mosques, it trained scholars, it sent diplomatic missions to China and other Muslim kingdoms. Islam did not erase earlier Filipino culture, it layered on top of it. Filipinos maintained their social structures, their languages, and their maritime traditions while adopting Islamic law and religious practices. Other sultanates followed, Maguindanao, Lanao. By the time Magellan arrived, Muslim sultanates dominated the southern Philippines. What was life like before colonization? Filipinos farmed rice, they fished, they hunted, they traded. The coastal villages were more accessible to trade with foreigners. These were ideal places for economic activity to develop. Business with traders from other countries also meant contact with other cultures and civilizations, such as those of Japan, Han Chinese, Indian people, and Arabs. They had their own writing systems. Baybayin script was used across Luzon and Visayas. The Kawi script shown in the Laguna Copperplate proves more advanced writing existed earlier. They had their own religions. Before Islam and before Christianity, Filipinos practiced animism. They believed in spirits called anitos. They worshipped a supreme god called Bathala in Tagalog regions. Each ethnic group had its own pantheon. Babaylans, spiritual leaders often female, performed rituals. They healed the sick, they blessed harvests. They communicated with spirits. They had music, they had dance. They had oral literature. Epic poems like the Daranjan of the Maranao and the Hudud of the Ifugao were passed down through generations. They wore jewelry made of gold. They tattooed their bodies. The Visayans were called pintados, the painted ones, by the Spanish because of their extensive tattoos. They built houses on stilts. They constructed boats that could cross oceans. They made weapons from bronze and iron. This was not a primitive society. This was a complex civilization with art, literature, religion, law, and trade networks spanning thousands of miles. By 1521, when Magellan arrived, the Philippines was already a network of thriving kingdoms and sultanates. Tondo controlled trade in Luzon. Maynila, a newer settlement, competed for power. Cebu dominated the Visayas. Butuan controlled northeastern Mindanao. The Sultanate of Sulu ruled the southwest. These were not unified under one government. The Philippines was never a single nation before colonization. It was hundreds of independent barangays, dozens of larger polities, and several powerful kingdoms. But they shared cultural elements. Similar languages, similar social structures, similar maritime traditions. They traded with each other. They fought with each other. They formed alliances. They conducted diplomacy. When Magellan arrived, he encountered sophisticated leaders who understood power, trade, and warfare. Raja Humabon of Cebu negotiated with the Spanish. Lapu-Lapu of Mactan killed Magellan in battle. These were not naive islanders encountering the outside world for the first time. These were experienced rulers who had dealt with Chinese traders, Arab merchants, Malay sultanates, and Japanese pirates for centuries. The history of the Philippines did not begin in 1521. It began with Negritos arriving 46,000 years ago. It continued with Austronesians sailing from Taiwan in 2200 BCE. It developed through barangay political systems, trade with China, Indianized kingdoms, and Islamic sultanates. By the time Magellan arrived, Filipinos had been writing for at least 621 years. They had been trading across Southeast Asia for over a millennium. They had been governing themselves for thousands of years. The landmark discovery of the Laguna Copperplate pushed back the start of Filipino history by 600 years, but archaeological evidence pushes it back even further. Filipino civilization was not created by colonization. It existed long before colonization. It was sophisticated, it was literate, it was connected to the wider world. This is the history that deserves to be told. The Philippines before Magellan was a civilization in full bloom. Now you know the truth. Drop a comment and tell me which part of pre-colonial Philippine history surprised you the most. Was it the Laguna Copperplate? The Austronesian migration? The Islamic sultanates? Let me know what you think. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into Philippine history, economy, and culture. I will see you in the next video.